Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and we are joined today by Pinhook's Sean Josephs, who is the founder and master blender of this unique and bright colored whiskey that you may see on your whiskey shelves with a little bit of New York flair with Kentucky roots. And Sean, thanks for joining the Bourbon Lens today.
It's great to be here, guys. Thank you so much.
And we really appreciate it because you are actually in one of like the most sought after destinations in the country, you know, for our summer perspective in Cape Cod today. So we really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy day with your family to hang out with us. And that's really something that we don't take for granted at all here, because I know bourbon people need to take time away. And whiskey people need to take time away. And speaking of that, shameless plug on our part, don't forget to check out our Wednesday episodes that talk to people in whiskey about what they do outside of whiskey with our Off Hours featuring Bourbon Lens podcast. So make sure that you check that out on Wednesdays. But Sean, so this colorful Pinhook bourbon that many people, or rye whiskey, many people have seen on their shelves, you know, how did you all come up with this idea to craft a new type of category with a eye towards the consumer and playing on horse racing and whiskey?
So it really started with, before the horses and before any of it, my background was working in restaurants. And I had, started as a food runner and worked my way up, and I was a waiter and did all that kind of stuff. Got really into wine. I'm a certified sommelier from the Court of Master Sommeliers. I have my sommelier certificate from the American Sommelier Association. And I later, worked at very high-end restaurants in New York, and ultimately also fell in love with bourbon, which, by the way, I think a lot of people might not know this, but even though there's sometimes a certain snobbery associated with wine people, once you, and I'm sure you guys have probably experienced this as you've gotten into whiskey, once you kind of develop your palate and you have an understanding, then you kind of apply it to everything. You think about the way you taste food, then you start to think more about the beer you're drinking, and then kind of anything that gets put in front of you, you start, becoming, just a little more critical or think more about what it is. I just got really into bourbon. We were talking about this earlier before we started. I got into bourbon in 2004, right? It was a much different time. I happened to have a friend who was way, way ahead of the curve. So he would have put almost anybody on these Instagram pages to shame back in 2002. He was buying bottles of Blanton's from Japan and the UK. And he had a black wax Maker's Mark bottle with Japanese writing on it, all this cool stuff. So he's kind of tasting me on all these cool whiskeys, and I'm thinking about it from a wine perspective where I'm tasting critically. And I'm like, wow, this Van Winkle 13-year rye that costs $55 is pretty complex and delicious, And so it kind of just made me fall in love with bourbon. And that ultimately led me to open a bourbon bar in Brooklyn in 2008 called Char No. 4, which really was ahead of its time, because at that point, that wasn't really a thing, having like a restaurant whose entire focus was American whiskey. And so what it led me to think, though, and we were also touching on this before we officially started the show, it was such a narrow category back then. There was there was one Maker's Mark, and that was their claim to fame. We make one thing, right? No single barrels, no cask strength, no barrel selects. Like, no one was really doing anything creative. I don't think that's even so much a criticism as just a fact of the time. Now I'm in my bourbon bar 70, 80 hours a week, talking to consumers all the time, looking at what's on the shelf. And as you guys remember too, it was just like each big distillery just had its standard thing, right? They had their 80 proof or their 86 proof, and then maybe they had a bottled in bond, and it was just all very conventional. No one was really playing around with finishes. It was really, I'd say, compared to where it is now, kind of boring as a category. Doesn't mean it wasn't delicious, but there was just not a lot of experimentation. And by the way, too, I still remember this. In 2008, I don't know, there were 3 craft distilleries, right? It was like Hudson Baby Bourbon, Stranahan's, St. George. Those were the, Balcones didn't exist yet. I think Whistle Pig, in terms of folks that were blending, like your NDP folks, Whistle Pig and High West had just started. right? So think about the landscape, right? And High West was quite creative relative to everything that was going on.
Yeah, I mean, 2008 is when I would say that the conversation around bourbon and whiskey started to pick up here in Kentucky. And then I think it hits critical mass on that like hockey stick approach, maybe 3 years later, 2010, 2011. That's when like you start to see the boom happen with whiskey production in America.
Well, you know what's crazy too? To that point, I remember traveling to Kentucky in like 2007, knowing that I was going to open this bourbon bar and looking for inspiration. And honestly, like, I mean, you can you can check me on this if I'm incorrect, but like all I really remember was going to Bourbon's Bistro, right? Like that was a place where you could go in and you're like, oh, and they've got all this whiskey. There was Proof on Main and there was Bluegrass Tavern. And I'm talking about places where you would go in and you're like, oh my God, this is bonkers. They have like so many bourbons, right?
Well, and that really didn't change until the last 5 years in Louisville.
Which is crazy, right? And so when I opened, like my feeling was when we opened Char No. 4 was this is the only American whiskey bar and restaurant in the United States of America focused on American whiskey specifically that's not in Kentucky. But, that's for that reason, GQ named Char No. 4 one of the 3 best places to drink bourbon in America. But as I always like to joke, that's because there were 5. Like it wasn't a competitive category. But keep in mind too, right? I had an incredible chef who'd worked for, famous chef Daniel Boulud. And New York Magazine also named us one of the 10 best new restaurants in all of New York.
Yeah. Right? And that's saying a lot.
It was a full service restaurant. So I think we did something else, which was part of my goal, was to say, I'd only seen bourbon like either in the dive bar scenario or like in a leather chair with a cigar. And I was thinking about it like a wine bar. Why can't you just have a really casual but sophisticated spot where you're a little bit trying to put it on the pedestal, like make people think about it as something that should really be given consideration, not just like a dive bar. And surround it with really great food and just kind of shift the perspective, But anyway, I don't think I went off topic, but I did have to kind of get to the point. So the point was I'm looking at all this and I'm like, there's got to be something different that we can do, that we can offer to the industry that's a different point of view. The biggest thing that made sense to me, again, this was long before the name Pinhook or horses or anything like that, was taking a winemaker's approach to whiskey. It was saying wine is all about vintage and that you make the best thing you can with your harvest every year. And that's part of the fun of it. Bourbon, particularly at the time, and still primarily, is based around a homogeneous flavor profile. So what I was starting to understand is like you have variability, as we all know from single barrels. And the majority of what you see is hiding the variability through blending. Because every time you go to do a batch, you're obviously blending different barrels than the ones you had prior. And even if you have a team of 20 people on your sensory team and you have a lab and you have all this stuff, you're still trying to reverse engineer a flavor profile at a specific proof. And so it was really born with the simple ideas like, wouldn't it be cool if we made a whiskey where the point wasn't for it to taste the same, just to taste the best? And that has been, that was the original inspiration long before there was any notion of like, well, how's that story going to be told from a name and a packaging standpoint? It was just like, why can't you make whiskey like wine and look at your barrels that are mature as your harvest and say, we're just going to try to put together the right combination of barrels to make the most delicious whiskey we can for the year. And then next year we'll do the same thing and we won't. And I would say this too. I don't have last year's whiskey next to me when we're blending a current vintage. So I'm not trying to not make it taste like it. And I'm also not trying to make it taste like it. I truly look at it in a vacuum. It's like you're starting over. And that's what makes it really fun.
Well, I think that also lends itself to the opportunity to bring in someone who may be wine inclined, right? Because they could say, oh, well, this is something I understand. I understand vintages. That's not something that most bourbon drinkers have really been exposed to, or rye whiskey drinkers have been exposed to outside the big launch of Castle and Key last year, right? Like I until we started talking today, I didn't really truly understand. I knew there was a vertical series, but like the vintage of Pinhook, I truly didn't understand. And so it's becoming more interesting to me how, you know, you all were on the precipice of that before, even someone like Castle and Key comes out, 2 years ago. And you all are
I think
6 or 7 years older, right? Like, there's some overlap there that I wasn't necessarily aware of as someone who's in the whiskey world,
yeah.
for lack of better terms.
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's, well, I appreciate you saying that. And that really is, I mean, I think that, no, especially in this industry, no one can say that they, like invented something or, what have you. But I do think I saw that as something that I, at least in my mind, had not seen. And keep in mind too, I understand, of course, that there was like an annual release of, let's say, George T. Stagg, and that the proofs obviously varied quite significantly from year to year. But I saw that as different because it's also kind of incidental. It's just like, it's a cask strength release of barrels of this age. And, but this was more truly a winemaker's approach where you're saying like, this is a product that's available year round, and we're making one big vintage of it. And then next year we're going to start over. So it's not like just a one-off of a limited item. It's like the core philosophy of every single product that we have.
Yeah. No, I admit I was a little bit intimidated by the Pinhook lineup just because of all the variation. And it's something that I'm not familiar with. And maybe it's just me being a traditional bourbon drinker. Just I find the brands that I like and I see what they do. And
Sure.
I go and grab those bottles. But, to really dive into this and see, that approach, which is the vintage, the 2022 vintage and things like that. I think it's super interesting. It's a lot more than just the different color wax on the bottle, which initially that was, I was just confused by all of the colors.
It's interesting you say that because I think it's a common, I don't know whether you call it like a critique or an observation. And it's funny to me. It's like, it's always hard to step back when you're the one who's been part of something from day one. But I look at it, it's like Johnny Walker Red, Johnny Walker Green, Johnny Walker Black, Johnny Walker Blue. Like it's, Weller is, I mean, we're hardly the first people to color code. Right. And but I think because the horses and then the vintages change, I don't think people understand that like orange is always orange in terms of it's an expression. We produce a new vintage of that expression each year, but it's like, if it was wine, it's like we make a Chardonnay and every year we release a new vintage of the Chardonnay. And so orange is our everyday bourbon. Green is everyday rye. Magenta is high proof bourbon. Teal is high proof rye. And those are the four core expressions that are all made from our custom distillate at Castle and Key. And then we have this vertical series, which I'm sure we'll get more into, which is basically was my plan to find something unique to do with our remaining MGP barrels, because we had no idea that we were going to have this opportunity with Castle and Key. That came through, Jamie Hill, who's our partner on the horse side. One of his oldest friends of 25 years is Will Arvin, who was the one who bought Old Taylor. So we were the first people that they approached about having a contract. We were the first people to sign a contract, but that was not on our radar. So it kind of came from the heavens, as it were. Like, we were just like, what now? Like everybody, it doesn't matter that you can make bourbon anywhere in the US. We saw it as a Kentucky thing when we bought our first MGP barrels in 2011 and shipped them to Bardstown. It's because we also wanted to spend time in Kentucky. Like, we weren't just like, oh, we'll buy some Indiana barrels and let them age in Indiana. And it wasn't even so much about the idea of the Kentucky climate. It was like, no, we want our barrels in Kentucky, so that we have an excuse to go to Kentucky 4, 5, 6 times a year and visit other distilleries and like soak up all the magic. Because to us, I think now, and I think Kentucky is embracing it now more, but I always felt like just like, yeah, we do bourbon. Like, as opposed, like, to me, it was like the mythical place, right? Like, this is where all the magic happens. And so we just wanted to we wanted to be able to touch it and be there and visit the other places. And that's really, and I guess to get back to the story, that's how we got from, we bought 20 barrels of MGP bourbon when it was $465 a barrel for 3-year-old stuff back in 2011. So we were able to start the company for $9,000 storage is $1 per barrel per month. So it was $240 in storage. So that was like, that's what it cost to start the company. And we weren't in any hurry. And so we had this vintage idea, as I was saying, and one of my two co-founders, so I have two founding partners, one Charles, who did all our packaging design, and one Jay, who, you know, had more of the business acumen and also had ties to Kentucky from his best friend from high school, Jamie Hill. So when we would come to Kentucky, we would stay at Jamie's house. Jamie grew up in thoroughbred horse racing. And so just not because we had any intention of tying it to, you know, what was this idea for, you know, our own bourbon brand. He's just, what else are you going to do? We're like hanging out at his house. He's like, guys, there's a horse sale going on at Keeneland, or, hey, we should go watch this horse breeze this morning at Keeneland, or, you know, let's go to this horse farm. Like, so we're just knocking around and having this amazing fun. You guys know, right? When you bring people in who don't know it and they experience it. But not only that, we're getting behind the scenes with someone who can take us down to the paddock and take us into the barn. And, you know, we're going behind the scenes and we're like, this is super cool. And he's explaining pinhooking, which I've never heard of. And he's explaining how, you know, buying baby thoroughbreds based on their lineage with the intent of selling them for a profit when they're mature. And we connected the dots that we were pinhooking bourbon because we knew we didn't want to have a distillery. Like, it just, none of us have that bent of science or chemistry, whatever. We just weren't interested in that. And so we're like, oh, we pinhook bourbon. We buy baby bourbon based on its lineage to sell it when it's mature. And just thought it was like a cool name. We also liked the idea because, as you guys know, there was a serious lack of transparency at that time. And it always drove me crazy in my bourbon bar. I'm like, why are you pretending that there's a distillery that doesn't exist? Like, it drives me nuts. And so that was also more of like the enthusiast perspective in me saying like, well, if I was to have my own bourbon, I would tell people exactly what's in it, how old it is, where it was made. I wouldn't hide anything. And so built into our name is even saying like, hey, we buy and sell barrels. Like, we don't have a distillery. Jamie also has a racing stable called Bourbon Lane Stable, which already existed. He was already naming all of his horses with bourbon and then later rye in the name of the horses, just because that's how he loved a bourbon. And he also thought, well, if you see a horse racing anywhere in the country with bourbon in the name, then you'll know it's a Bourbon Lane horse. So you can see how all the pieces started to come together. And then we were like, you know what would be cool is, in order to kind of reinforce this idea of a vintage, if every year it was a different horse. And so it was a way of saying the label's unique every year. There's something different about the label, and there's something different about the juice in the bottle. Right. So it was something real, and that these are active racing thoroughbreds, but it was also kind of a metaphor for this idea of something new and something different. The other thing, and I feel like it's okay to pick on them because they're a multi-billion-dollar corporation. I remember thinking how lame the Woodford Derby thing was, because I was like, what's the point of putting the same juice in the same bottle and just changing the label? Right. And so I'd seen all these things like around horses. And again, I think the one thing that I'm sure I have in common with you guys, and what is also different about Pinhook, although you're starting to see more and more of it, is like, you guys, I'm sure, have a lot of opinions about what people do, what you might do if you did something, what you like. I think there were even more opinions to be had 10 years ago, when you're like, you know, basically there wasn't that much experimentation. And so I was just looking at things from like the consumer perspective, where I would say, like, me personally, and this isn't me as a supplier criticizing another supplier, this is just how I felt as a bourbon bar owner. I was like, what is the point of this Woodford label? Like, what's the point? Like, why can't you be bothered to make another blend? Can't you at least be bothered to make a special blend for the Derby each year and make it like the birthday bourbon thing's kind of cool? Why can't you do something like that for the Derby? So a lot of what Pinhook is kind of a reaction to things that I thought could be different, and also a reaction to things, not to focus on anything negative, but things that I was like, oh, well, you could do that better. Or I don't like that much. And so to me, the authenticity, and like we'd also seen Maker's Mark does, they do a commemorative bottle for the Derby winner or the Triple Crown winner. And I'm kind of like, but the horse already won. And then you're doing it after the fact. So the other thing with Pinhook is Jamie picks whichever horse he thinks has the best chance of winning the Kentucky Derby. And that's the horse that ends up on our bottle. And by the way, a lot of the horses, as you guys know, do terrible because it's the horse business, right? And but that to me is where that's where the authenticity is, right? Is in this idea that there is no like, yeah, he does his best. And then every year when we criticize him for not getting us a Derby horse, he says, he reminds us there are 25 or 27,000 foals born in Kentucky every year and only 20 slots in the Derby. So he doesn't have the easiest job in the world.
No, I mean, he's taken a complete and utter crapshoot at getting that right. And if he hits one, I mean, good for him and good for you all, because that means that bottle and that vintage is going to sell like hotcakes.
Yeah. But I think to me, it's like, I love being able to dig in with people because then I can explain to them that it's not just as simple as like, oh, of course, bourbon and horses, two things Kentucky's most famous for, is like the horses specifically tie to our unique vintage idea. They're helping express that idea. And same thing, the bright colors, like Charles, when he was doing the design, he did his research and learned that, jockeys, before the Jumbotron and all of this had to wear brightly colored silks because how else do you see your horse on the backstretch through binoculars? You can't see the number. You're just looking for that little flash of color. And so that's why we have these bright colors. And everyone's like, oh, you have these bright colors probably because you want to stand out. And you're like, yes, absolutely. But it also ties specifically into something, authentic about thoroughbred horse racing. So, and Jamie was the one who was always really keeping us honest because he would even the horses are hand drawn by this woman, Noli Novak, who does all the portraits for the Wall Street Journal. And we would have a picture and he'd be like, no, I don't like it because of the way the horse's ears are pointing. So even though these are things that the average person wouldn't pick up on, we have someone who wakes up every day and is in the horse business. Yep. And he keeps us honest and making sure that as a litmus test. Now, I will say one of the funny things was we have another friend who's in the horse business who was like, he's like, Indiana whiskey. I mean, again, this was like in 2011. He's like, you guys are crazy. Like, no one's going to drink your whiskey from Indiana. He ended up changing his mind, but
for sure. So now that you have, you all have established, right? I think when I was doing a little research prior to this, this is year 5 of the vintages. Is that correct?
Well, it really started with, we weren't, even though they weren't vintage dated.
Yeah.
Even the library series that we were talking about, those were vintages because there were 7 releases and no 2 of those were the same. So it really started in 2014.
Okay. So we're 8 years into this now. And, one of the things we touched on about standing out in the colors, how is that from a consumer acquisition perspective? That's a really weird question. I've been watching a crap ton of Shark Tank. And so I can hear Mr. Wonderful in my head saying, what's the customer acquisition cost? But what's that like to educate the consumer on those different verticals and get them to adopt?
You're asking what I think is the $1 million question, right? Because I know what it's like to talk to folks like you who are enthusiasts, or maybe people who aren't into it as much as you are, but know about bourbon. Maybe they're not big collectors, but they're into it. And it's really easy. I think if I just say, it's I could take 2 hours to tell the Pinhook story. But if you ask me to boil it down, I would say, we take a winemaker's approach to whiskey. This is an industry where everyone is primarily trying to replicate a flavor profile at the same proof. And we take the opportunity to make we make the best whiskey, not the same whiskey. Right? That's something that resonates with people very easily if they have any understanding. The $1 million question, which I find so fascinating, and I literally realized as I'm thinking about it that I have no idea how it works, is that you don't know so much of your, I don't know. If I asked you guys what percentage of the bourbon that's consumed is consumed by people who are really knowledgeable, what would you say?
Oh man, I'd say it's pretty low.
Yeah, I would say that the enthusiast or the bourbon connoisseur, right? Is probably less than 1% of drinkers.
Right. I would agree with that. So this is what I actually think. I think that the average person who's probably pulling any of these products off the shelf, unless it's being hand sold to them, right? Unless someone comes in, they're like, hey, I'm having a party and I'm looking for a rye because I'm making some Manhattans. What do you recommend? And maybe someone could be someone that I met or someone who just happens to be enthusiastic about Pinhook rye. And they're like, you should try this one. I'm a big fan of what these guys are doing. And probably it doesn't go much further than that. They're probably not even talking about vintages or anything. I mean, how many people drink makers and don't even know it's weeded, right? The same 99%.
Yeah.
Right. Like, so I think, and it's what at least I'm hopeful of because we've had a lot of success, is simply that if there's one thing people know about Kentucky, it's that it's the land of bourbon and horses. And when you put the two of them together, it just makes sense. It, hits that little part in the brain where you're like, and hopefully we certainly get a lot of feedback that people like our bottles.
Yeah.
That the design stands out. And in a world of expensive craft whiskey, our whiskey is incredibly affordable. And that's really intentional. It's not just a strategy. It's a philosophy based on the fact that what got me into bourbon in the first place was how inexpensive it was. Right. Like, it's still hard for me. It's like not from the good old days, but Elijah Craig 18 was a $48 bottle. So that's what made me fall in love with whiskey. It doesn't make me mad that it's now $200 and whatever dollars a bottle, but it's more like, imagine how different your perspective would be when you think of like, I can't ever probably get past the point of the way I thought of bourbon was like, wow, this is the greatest value in the world.
Yeah.
It's so complex. And Evan Williams single barrel is $28.99. Right. Like, or that like, JTS Brown bottled in bond is $14. Like,
Scott, he just spoke your love language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, while we can't, we don't have the scale and, all of the economics to be able to be that inexpensive, but, our product, sits on the shelf our flagship is between $35 and $38. So I think for the average person, that's something approachable.
Well, and not only is it approachable, this also would be a great gift bottle, right? Like, because it's unique, it's fun, it's got a lot of color. And so if they've heard anything about anything, they're like, oh, this is interesting. Let me buy it as a gift.
Can I tell you something, though? I should try to get back to your original point, which I guess I've already partially expressed. I don't know the answer, but I do think good looking package, fair price, sort of a concept that people would just naturally gravitate to or understand, it's just something appealing, whether it's a gift or whatever, easy to pull off the shelf. One of the investors in Pinhook now, like, he lives, I live in New Orleans. He was introduced to Pinhook because he simply pulled it off the shelf at Whole Foods. Right. It was actually the rye. And I was at a school function and I was wearing a Pinhook t-shirt and his wife saw my shirt and said, that's my husband's favorite bourbon. And he doesn't know anything. So I think that's like one little story, but it probably does give you a little window into like, so, and that's the other thing that happens. Some people are just like, it appeals to their eye.
Yeah.
It appeals to their sensibility. Like, they don't know why they pulled this bottle over that bottle or, and they just grab it. And then they're like, this is really good. And then they just like take ownership of it. It becomes their thing.
Yeah. I tell you what, and Scott, has done a great job for us on our socials and created a lot of relationships. There was a store that did a Pinhook pick that was like on a night when we drank a lot of bottles that were limited and rare and so on and so forth. The Pinhook single barrel that we were able to get a hold of was by far the best whiskey we drank.
Which store was it?
It was Green Farm Spirits.
Oh yeah. The Connecticut one.
Yeah.
The bright yellow wax tip and label, and we had that with some cigars one evening, and the bottle didn't last very long.
I wonder, going back to your point, and this has at least been my argument, is that it's also, we did start in 2014. But then 2015 is when we changed the packaging and then started using the colors to create categories. I mean, how long did it take Johnny Walker? I mean, that's part of my thing too, is like, it's just education. I mean, so many more people have heard of Pinhook than they had 3 years ago or 5 years ago, or probably even than had 2 years ago. And so eventually, in the same way that people just know, I mean, maybe I'm being overly optimistic or ambitious, but if we keep at it and we keep having success, people will just become comfortable with it. And the bottom line too, right, is the two colors you're most likely to see on the shelf are orange and green. Right. Yeah. And then magenta and teal, which are the high proofs, are limited. So they tend to only be on the shelf for 3 to 6 months, but I don't know if a store would have all 4. So they might just have 3. And I just think it's going to take some time. And I think it's also something that makes us different than a lot of the other, younger brands. We're really focused on that flagship product.
Yeah.
We're not just playing of course we have limited stuff, but we're not just playing off the limited thing. And that to me is really important because it goes back to this idea of wanting to do something accessible, wanting to do something every day, and looking at the vintage like that. And as you guys know, you can think of so many brands now who are like, and they're on batch number, 78. and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it's a completely different, and you're like, this batch versus that batch. Whereas even though every vintage is meant to taste different, we're ultimately trying to build an understanding and a appreciation of orange and green. And I do suspect that there are people, going back to the more casual consumer, that are just, they don't even notice when it changes.
Yeah, they're just grabbing it because they've seen that label.
They drink the orange.
Yeah.
Yeah. They grab the orange, they grab the green.
Yeah. And I think what's really interesting is we're lucky enough in Kentucky, most of the time when I go to Liquor Barn, they do have at least 3 colors.
Yes, they do. They're really nice to us. And the one I would really look out for, I think it should be on the shelf. This year, we started doing our true small batch in the same yellow color.
Okay.
We did it in magenta in the past, this is only the second year of it. And the problem was enough people have magenta on the shelf that there wasn't enough clear delineation between magenta high proof versus magenta small batch or true small batch. So we decided to flip it to the yellow, even though yellow before was just single barrels. Now yellow is the small batch, but the small batch is the only 4 and 5 year old Castle and Key that we put out. And it's a 3-barrel blend where you start with 6 single barrels. You taste through all 6. If you're doing a 3-barrel blend and you start with 6 barrels, you have 20 possible combinations of 3.
Yeah.
Oh.
I'd say on average, like when I sit down with Brad Williams to do the blending, for Liquor Barn, I'd say typically we would do more like 6 or 7 blends. Wow. Not 20, because at that point you kind of know. But then you really get to understand, even if you keep the 2 barrels the same, you just roll in one and you're like, wow, that shifted in a crazy way, for better or for worse. Okay, well, now let's try pulling this one out and dropping this one. Let's pull these 2 out and pull these 2 in. And you just keep, and it's really a microcosm of our blending process that we do at scale, done at a really small scale. But anyway, you should see Cox's Evergreen did one.
Yeah.
That one maybe got a little too famous for other reasons.
Yeah, that one did get a little famous, and I'm sure the largest liquor purchaser in Kentucky won't be too far behind them in Kroger, because Chris Blandford doesn't like to be left out when it comes to some cool experiences for Kroger customers.
Yeah, we did one for. We also did one for the Omni.
Oh,
so they did the Omni has a true small batch. Liquor Barn has a true small batch, and Cox's Evergreen has a true small batch.
The Cox's Evergreen one is gone, and we may even just cut that part out.
Oh yeah. But I think that one. Those were unrelated.
Yeah.
But we'll see. We'll see if they want to do it again next year, and maybe I didn't even know they were going to do a label. I didn't know that they had a reputation for doing, not Cox's, but Louisville Bourbon Society. I didn't know that. I know people do stickers, but I don't really think about who's doing a sticker, who's not doing a sticker. Like we just did the blend. So
yeah, no, I'll have to go check out those. I'll have to go check out those small batches because we're at about 35, 40 minutes here. And I just have kind of been sipping throughout. And what I will say is like, I kind of lean back towards the orange, and I'm on the vertical series right now, just kind of been sipping. But I think the orange label, like at 100 proof, gives me enough of that like popcorny oil texture, right? But it also gives me a little bit of fruit, a little bit of chocolate, like on the back end. Yeah. So you get enough of the barrel influence, and you get enough of like the corn sweetness. Like if you were going to drink like some mellow corn type notes, that like I think stood out even above some of the other ones, even like the magenta. Like I think that went away a little bit. I think the added water to get that down to 100 proof is more my flavor profile. And to be honest, like I'm not a super high proof guy, nor is Scott. We kind of lend more in that 100, 110 range.
I think that, and the other reason too, it's like, I just like people to have the options, right? Because I think the high proof, like that can, obviously the orange wax would work too, but like the high proof can make a great old fashioned, and I also, again, contrary to, the trend, I've always been a fan of ice in whiskey, just because I don't really think that, especially in America where like the ambient room temperature is going to be like 78 degrees. I just don't think that's a very good temperature at which to enjoy whiskey. I think a lot about temperature because in wine, it's obviously considered to be very important. And typically the argument in wine is that most people drink their red wines too warm and their white wines too cold. Right? Because white wine should actually, it's like anything. If you get a white wine too cold, then you can't taste the nuance and the depth of flavor because it's too cold. And if you drink, same thing, but if a red wine is too warm, then you're also missing out on some of the, you're missing maybe some of the flavors, but you're missing more like this idea that it should still provide some sort of refreshment.
A slightly chilled red wine just makes me the happiest person in the world. When it's not, I'm just so frustrated. If I go to high-end steakhouse and they give me a warm red wine, I just want to throw the bottle back at them.
I would always tell people like the really good rule of thumb would be if you're going to drink a red wine, let's assume you don't have a cellar, right? So it's at room temperature, put it in the fridge 20 minutes before you're going to drink it.
Yep.
If you're going to drink a white wine that's in the fridge, take it out of the fridge 20 minutes before you're going to drink it. Right. And then, but same thing, I don't think, so I think that, putting the high proof over a big, I'm not saying it's like designed and like you should drink it this way, but that's what I also have in mind with that one is like, if you were sitting there sipping them all neat, absolutely I could see, the orange is my favorite. But if you put both of them over a big cube.
Exactly, because you can enjoy it for a longer period of time. So you pour a 2-ounce pour instead of a 1-ounce pour over that cube, and then the dilution, you're probably going to end up drinking more something like 110, 108, like after an hour, if you're not consuming quickly.
Yeah, and that's what I like, right, is you're just like, that to me is when I look at the two, it's just kind of like they provide two different potential drinking experiences. And then again, it's hard to say because a lot of people just insist on only drinking their stuff neat. And also to me, it's just variable. Like sometimes I might want to drink the orange wax over a big cube. Sometimes I might want to drink it in a big cup full of ice. And sometimes I might want to drink it neat. And it just depends.
Drink whiskey how you want to, right?
Yes.
So to clarify, the orange and the magenta are not the same exact blend.
That's the other difference, right? So it's not like we did one big blend, proofed some of it at 100 and then proofed the other at 116. It's that they're two different blends.
Yeah.
So there's a brand new vintage of each every year as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's some distinct flavors in both of them. And that's the one thing I was curious to ask. I was like, these don't seem like
because
the same
again, and then there's
whiskey.
The only relationship is that it's both Castle and Key bourbon with barrels of a similar age and the same mash bill. But outside of that, again, they're done in a vacuum. So I'm not thinking like, how's the high proof going to land this year as it relates to this year's flagship? That's not part of the thought process. It's again, that's what keeps it fun for me is I sit down to do that blend. And again, you're like starting at zero and you're just like, I wonder how this is going to turn out. And I think that's an approach that's like in winemaking, they call it non-interventionist winemaking. So it's this idea that I don't have a preconceived notion of trying to push it like, oh, Pinhook has this signature spice. It's just like it lands where it lands, right? So the whole point of the blending process, and it's what I learned in like how you deductively taste wine is like, well, if you try to say to someone, why is this wine great or why is this bourbon great? You know, and you want to go beyond because it tastes really good. You'd say because it has complex aromas, it has complex flavors, it has a great texture, right? It has something that maybe is like a little hard to pinpoint if you're not experienced, but is the idea of like balance and harmony, right? It's something about the relationship to, okay, there are all these complex flavors and there's just something about the way they travel across your palate that really works in harmony, that it has a long lingering finish. And I would say something that's particularly important in whiskey that you do also think about it in wine, but is perception of alcohol, right? It all has a lot of alcohol, but I think you guys know when you get that like ethanol heat, you want the alcohol to be really kind of interwoven and kind of knitted into the spirit. It's like, it's 118 proof, whatever. It's a lot but it doesn't mean you have to smell ethanol on the nose or taste on the palate. Like it's going to have weight and heat, but you really want it to all be cohesive. And so that's really what I'm looking for. And that's the fun of the blending process when you don't have a preconceived notion. Maybe one year it's going to be more fruity and floral and caramely, and maybe another time it's going to be more earthy, leathery, and spicy. And you don't have a preconceived notion of one being better than the other. It just needs to check all of those benchmarks of quality that I mentioned. And as long as it does that, then it's successful. And some are going to appeal more to one person's palate than another because they're like, oh, this one's really spicy and earthy, and I prefer more bright and fruity.
Yeah.
But I would like to say that structurally they're the same.
Well, and I think that's what's interesting. When you said that these were a little under 4 years, the flagship's a little under 4 years old, I was expecting a big hint of ethanol, like right off the palate, and you actually get full flavor on the nose, and you get that corn grain influence like we were talking about, which is really nice because sometimes in more youthful bourbons, right? Like there's toes a line, right? I think young is when it's like really close to 2, and then youthful is like when it's creeping above 3, but not necessarily 4 to get that delineation of potentially bottom and bond, right? Like it's got that youthful like exuberance because it's giving you all types of flavors versus it being young and saying like, it smells like alcohol. Scott, like this is like kind of your sweet spot, like in this range. So like, I'm interested just in your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, the most surprising part to me was just how much the nose on each of them. Like I tasted them last night. I lined all 4 of them up and just smelled them. I mean, I spent probably more time just smelling and nosing the 4 of them side by side than I did, tasting and comparing, because I've got mostly nosing notes, which I'm sure that's part of your culinary and your wine background that's really speaking there.
Yeah, I really appreciate you saying that, and that's absolutely correct. Meaning, what the process that I was describing of the true small batch, that's the process that we're doing at scale. So let's say I'm doing a 100-barrel blend, right? I pull 130 single barrel samples, right? Most people blend in the tank, I would say, or they're blending in the tank because they're just trying to hit a profile. And so it's more about tasting throughout the rick house and feeling confident when they pull X number of barrels from these different places that it will hit their target flavor profile. We pull 130 samples. That's for a 100-barrel blend. That's unwieldy to work with, right? So we take equal parts of 10 single barrels and consolidate them into a new sample bottle. Does that make sense? So now I've consolidated 130 to 13.
Yeah.
But if I'm doing, now I go through and taste all 13 of those. This is all at cast strength. Taste all of them and take my notes on each one, similar to probably the way you would on a single barrel. You're just trying to, and I call those blocks and saying like, I'm trying to understand what are the components of each block. This one is really, and then I'm really trying to focus on broad strokes. Like, wow, this one is all about baking spice primarily. Like if I had to, sure, it has other things going on, but this one is all about caramel. This is all about wood tannin. This one is, fruit, etc. If I'm doing a 10 block blend or a 100 barrel blend, and I have 13 blocks / 130 barrels, I have almost 400 possible combinations of 10. Now, same thing as I was describing before, by the time I've tasted through all 13, I probably don't need to do more than 6 or 7. But to go to your point, Scott, like now I can sit there and say, let's try these 10 and say, that's great on the palate, but it has no nose. It's totally flat. Not acceptable, because to me, I've got to hit all these benchmarks: aromatic complexity, palate complexity, balance, length of finish, alcohol integration, texture. Let's try it again. And then sometimes you get into this battle. It's like, well, now the nose is really good, but I think the finish is a little short. And so but again, the fun part of it, and I do think it's an advantage of being able to do it this way, is on the one hand, people would say, well, isn't that harder? Because it's like you're always starting over, but it also means there are no limitations.
Yeah. Well, and I think
you can just keep going. You just get to keep blending until you're like, and since there are no notes you need to hit, you just need to keep blending until you're like, I think this is really, really good. And then you can, and then on top of it, that's all at cast strength. Now we get to try it at 5 or 6 different proofs.
Yeah.
As well.
Well, and I think that's really interesting, like hearing your perspective versus like Blue Run's perspective versus like talking to Dixon Deadman, like when he had Kentucky Owl. Like each of you all are blending houses at your core, right? Like that's what you all are doing. And to hear those different notes and like the different way that the methodology, I think that's the mad scientist that a lot of people don't think about. Nancy Fraley's another, great example of that. Like, those mad scientist combinations and thinking about it, like to you to start all over, like that's not a big thing. Like you're like, you know what? Like it's not where we need it to be. So I want it to hit this level. Right. And so it's just fun to hear each of your all's different perspective when it comes to that, because a lot of people don't understand the artisanal value that blending brings to the finished product.
Yeah. It's fun too. I mean, sometimes I'll do 2 options. I'll have 2 options that I like, and then you proof both of them. So it's like you go from 130 to 13 to whittle it down to 2. Then you expand it back to 12 because you have 2 options, and maybe you do 6 proofs of both. And the other thing that I'll do a lot, well, almost, I would say at this point, I do it 100% of the time, is if it's once I then narrow it down again, then we'll taste them blind. Because think about how important blind tasting is, which is something that was obviously a big part of my wine education. And I'm sure you guys will do some blind stuff on your own. But now think about it from the whiskey creation standpoint, is you're saying, I'm agnostic. I just want the best whiskey. And even though I do this for a living, it's hard not to have some preconceived notions of like, okay, we're down to options 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going into it thinking that 1 was my favorite. It's hard to let go of whatever little synapses fired that made you think that like, yeah, option 1 is the best. Right. So then you have to like, in order to like rewire, then you're just like, all right, I want to put all 3 of these in front of me and I don't want to know which is which. And who knows? It depends. Sometimes it'll be pretty obvious to me which is which anyway, but other times, it won't be. And I'm just like, I don't know which is which, but the third one is by far my favorite. And it's like, well, that was actually option 2.
Yeah.
Oh shit. Okay, great. But that's what won, so to speak. So let's put that in a bottle. And I think that's what makes it really fun for me, is you're just really saying, let the best whiskey win.
Well, and it's almost like picking the horses for the bottles, right? Like at the end of the day, when you think about it, like you're picking your best blend to win, and you're hoping that one day the horse that you put on front of this is going to win the Derby or win the Triple Crown or whatever. And it's all a bet, right? Like you're betting on your all's processes and expertise. And I think when it comes to the consumer, we don't have that most of the time, right? We don't have that process or expertise. We are going in either because our dad liked Jim Beam or Heaven Hill or whatever, and that's what we're picking. And I think people need to go and see if they can, hit the Mega Millions, because that got us almost up to $1 billion the other day. And try new whiskeys and go to the betting window and take a bet on something else. That's kind of how I would approach this, right?
Yeah.
Just like hearing it's all a strategic bet, and I think that's a pretty cool way to look at this.
I love the way you said that, and I think it's really a lot of those parallels that we drew between. We saw a lot of similarities between thoroughbred horse racing and bourbons, like young versus old, the lineage, the take some luck, a bit of a bet, all that type of stuff. And the other thing too is, like, I think in the end, right, we can talk about blending, and you were talking about these other folks who all blend, and in the end, everyone believes that they have a good approach and it produces a good product. But the reality is 99% of the people, maybe don't taste critically enough to really be able to discern. I'm not saying they don't have good palates. I'm just saying they've never even really done that exercise, or to say, like, wow, it's like people will say to me about wine all the time. They'll just be like, I just honestly can't tell the difference between a $100 bottle of wine and a $30 bottle of wine. Like, or even a $10 bottle of wine. They all taste the same to me. And so I think about that not as a negative, but just as a reality. And then what I think is, in the end, aside from what we were talking about before, which is just like, it's a bottle on a shelf and it's just packaging and it's a little bit of luck, it's also philosophy. And so that's what I'm betting on too, is this idea that someone will say that I thought, yeah, there's a room to take a different approach. And that approach is to say, we don't want it to taste the same. Every blend is a unique opportunity, or every vintage is a unique opportunity to make a different whiskey. And some people are going to hear that, and that alone is what's going to sell them on it. They're just going to like the attitude or the philosophy, right? That's what ends up mattering. So, because I think arguing on flavor is or quality is a pretty pointless argument.
Yeah.
To say that you do it this way and it tastes better than everyone else's. That's like a pretty pointless endeavor.
No, that's a great point that you make about philosophy of just whiskey making in general. And I'm excited for our listeners to hear that, because I'm sure there's a lot of our listeners that they look for the house style. They look for, or maybe their question is, hey, what would Pinhook's house style be? And it's that there isn't one. It's that
Correct.
We're creating something every year, every vintage, that tastes good at that time based upon what we have. And, I think that that's very respectable. Yeah. As complex as it is. And, I know I get overwhelmed with sample bottles sitting around, and I've seen some of your Instagram posts where you've got boxes of samples that just have arrived. I think you did this last year in the middle of the pandemic, but you had like 200 sample bottles.
It was a lot of whiskey.
And I was just like, I can't even begin to imagine. It's like, well, how do you eat an elephant one bite at a time?
Yeah.
That was what I was thinking, that, like, how do you dive into that many samples? But hearing your approach about breaking those into chunks, or, segments of single barrels, I think that's very insightful as well.
And I would also say too, to your point about house style, I think in the same way, like, if you're a winery and you make different wines, and let's say you have one Pinot Noir that's like your single vineyard, and typically then what happens, it's like, well, that's the better fruit. So then it gets the better barrels, and it gets like, it's made in a certain style. But then you have the other one that's like the easy one, right? Those two wines would be your single vineyard versus your estate, let's call it, for argument's sake. Stylistically, those would be different from each other, because one is meant to be more complex and the other is meant to be more simple. But then, because of the harvest every year, the expression will taste a bit different every year, right? So that's what I would say. It's like, you'd have to sort of get into this idea that the orange wax is stylistically the same every year, even though it always tastes different, right? Because it's always going to be barrels that are between 3 to 3.5 years old. It's always going to be in the certain proof range. It's always going to be meant to be an everyday sipper. Hopefully it'll always have good complex aromas and flavors, and be a balanced, harmonious whiskey. It's just, if you were to taste two vintages side by side, you'd be like, oh, this one has a lot more baking spice, and this one, has a lot more fruit, or whatever the case might be. But they would still be stylistically similar, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And ultimately, at the end of the day, like, I think that's what will keep people coming back to the shelf is the fact that when they pick up that bottle or they have multiple years of that vintage, they can have an experience, right? So you can invite friends over, you can invite people to that have that conversation and see if you can pick up those stylistic differences. Like I just hosted a tasting on Monday for a charity event, and I brought a variety of different things, and I what people didn't realize is like how years change and vintages changes and weeded versus non-weeded. And like walking through bourbon, I think more and more people, the average consumer is going to start to do that. Even if they're not educated, they're going to try like, hey, I like this year over year. Did it change? And so they might have 2 or 3 bottles of something, and that might lead them to a better conversation or diving more into the industry. And, one day we'll have a bourbon sommelier type deal, right? Like where people really truly understand that.
I think you're totally right. And I don't think it's not even so much about, one being better than the other, but I do think you'll just get a more educated consumer. And the end result of that is like, think about the consumer who's not educated, but they still have this understanding that single malt Scotch is something special, whereas blended Scotch is less special. Now, whether that's actually the case is a different argument, but maybe at some point, more of the average consumer would understand. It's like, there's some people that make unique vintages and there are other people who just blend to a homogeneous flavor profile. And again, maybe it's not even so much that there's a value judgment, but even just understanding that exists. Like there are 2 ways to approach it, I mean, the one thing I find fascinating though, and I wonder if people will catch on to this, it wasn't my original intent because single barrels weren't actually a thing when I opened my bourbon bar. Right? Like that whole thing hadn't happened. I mean, they existed, but like it wasn't what it is today. I think that, and this is hardly like a big idea, single barrels are the most popular thing amongst the connoisseurs. Why? Because it's exciting that 4 barrels filled even on the same day, aging next to each other in the rickhouse can all taste wildly different from each other. So that experience of going through the 4 and be like, whoa, are you kidding me? This one has these crazy like eucalyptus note, and this other one is like all just tastes like a butterscotch bomb, whatever it is. That gets people excited, right? And now think about the idea that I'm simply taking that and applying it to blending, except it's exponentially more complex and has exponentially more possibility, because in the same example we gave before, you could have 6 single barrels, right? And do a 3-barrel blend where you have 20 options, or you could just lay out 6 single barrels and pick one of them, in which case you have 1 choice, or you have 6 choices, I suppose, but you end up with. So I think that once people start to understand that it represents such a world of possibility, and what they're being offered, again, it's not a criticism of it, but what they're being offered is someone saying, do you know that literally, especially if you think of like you're at Heaven Hill and you have 1 million barrels aging, the potential for all the types of blends you could do is just astronomical. And instead they're like, and in spite of that, these are these 5 things that we make or whatever it is. And we're going to work really, really hard to hide all of the variability that exists for all of the different reasons. And so that from your perspective as a consumer, you just can't tell the difference between a bottle you bought 10 years ago and a bottle that you'll buy 3 years from now.
Yeah. No, I think that's really interesting. And I think, as we wrap up today, like this conversation is just the beginning. Like the conversation with Sean today, is going to be, Pinhook and Bourbon Lens 2.0, because we can pick up from that point. Like we could probably have a 3.5 hour podcast on this because there's just so much information and there's so much to really unpack, and we're just scratching the surface. And that's why I think it's exciting to continue the conversation, here in a few months when there's probably new product, new things in market, because that conversation will continue to evolve and grow and develop as Pinhook evolves and grows and develop as a brand, right? And I think that's the beauty of it.
And not only could we talk for 3.5 hours, but then if we waited 2 years, then we could talk another 3.5 hours. Because what keeps this fun for me is like, I'm hardly the first one to do this, but I started, because I have so many samples at Jamie's house, we got this infinity barrel going. Right?
Yeah.
It was pretty eye-opening to me because it's such a mishmash. I mean, it probably has close to 2,000 single barrels in it. Right. And you know, plenty of people, and I mean, barrels even released an infinity product. Right.
Yeah.
But I learned a lot from it already, because there was the first day where we just had to like clean out Jamie's house, and like, Jamie, this is crazy. We're like over inundating your house with all these samples. So we just like dumped a bunch of bottles in and like filled the thing maybe halfway or so. And right off the bat, it actually had a really great aroma, and the palate was just super out of whack, like not in balance, all this type of stuff. The longer it sat, it's just somehow all the whiskey just seemed to like, it's kind of like if you make a lasagna, it always tastes better 3 days later. It's just like all the flavors kind of meld together. Yeah. They like find their way. And I was surprised how dramatically it improved. Not, I think, from more wood influence, but just somehow it's like, and I don't mean to make it sound like mystical, but it's like somehow it all found its way. Like the longer it all sat together for like now, like 6 months, I was like, it's crazy how good that is, being that it's so random. It's Castle and Key bourbon and rye of many ages. It's MGP bourbon and rye of many ages. It's like all over the map. It's
American whiskey at its finest, right?
Yeah. And then that got me thinking. And so that's what keeps it interesting for me, is like, as much as we've developed like this overall process, I just feel like I can't even begin to think of all the things that makes me think could be interesting.
Yeah.
In terms of actually making something at a larger scale, but using some of those principles.
No, I think that's pretty cool. So, maybe be on the lookout from an infinity bottle from Pinhook in the next couple of years. That's what I got out of that last little tidbit.
If nothing else, you guys, where are you guys? Are you in Lexington or are you in Louisville?
We're in Louisville.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, maybe I can twist your guys' arm to come visit
I'm in Lexington 7 Saturdays of the fall. So Kentucky football plays and I will be in Lexington. Awesome. So really appreciate, Sean, you joining us today. Where can people just find out a little bit more about Pinhook if they don't already know?
I think the easiest is either our website, pinhookbourbon.com, and then also our Instagram. We try to use that as a place to educate folks. I think we recently had a post going back to the wax colors that was just flashing each color and saying, what does each color represent?
The tutorial.
The tutorial, yeah. So we try to educate people on the product. So I think those are the two best places.
Great. Well, Sean, thanks again. And thank you, everyone, for listening to this episode of The Bourbon Lens. You can find us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Bourbon Lens. We'd also be really appreciative if you go over to your favorite podcast listening app and give us a 5-star review. Leave us a review. We work really hard on this and would really appreciate any feedback that you may have. And lastly, if you want exclusive opportunities to partner alongside Bourbon Lens, go over to patreon.com/Bourbon Lens. We have exclusive tastings and exclusive opportunities to get our single barrels early and other fun things that Scott and I are dreaming up as we move forward. And until next time, appreciate it. Thanks. Cheers.
Cheers.